In the 1950s, the CIA needed a word to describe a very specific kind of nightmare, the hidden, unintended costs of their own covert operations. They called it blowback. When leaders draw up foreign policy, they tend to think like physicists. They assume that if they apply a specific amount of force, action A, they will neatly and predictably get result B. Geopolitics doesn't work in a vacuum. The moment a nation intervenes outside its own borders, it introduces infinite variables, local culture, shifting weather, hidden agendas, and centuries of history that it simply cannot control. Today, we are going to examine 3 distinct ways foreign policy spins out of control. We will look at how interventions manufacture violent blowback, trigger accidental military evolution, and cause the total loss of national sovereignty. To accurately read modern history, you have to look past the speeches and the stated intentions of world leaders. You have to measure the unpredictable shockwaves they leave behind. In the late 1970s, the United States wanted to stall Soviet expansion in Afghanistan without committing American troops. Through Operation Cyclone, the CIA began funneling money and weapons to local guerrilla fighters known as the Mujahideen. The logic was simple: arm the enemy of your enemy. But those weapons and that training did not stay neatly contained within pro-Western factions. They trickled down to the most radical elements in the region. Among the beneficiaries of this covert support was a young fighter named Osama bin Laden. The loose network built to harass the Soviets eventually captured much of Afghanistan as the Taliban and evolved directly into al-Qaeda. Decades later, the cycle repeated. U.S. support for the Free Syrian Army trickled into factions that helped form ISIS. And most recently, after the collapse of the Afghan government, the U.S. relocated thousands of members of covert, CIA-backed Afghan strike teams, known as Zero units, onto American soil. These units were utilized for brutal night raids in Afghanistan. Bringing them stateside carried heavy risks, culminating recently in a horrific Thanksgiving Day shooting in Washington, D.C., perpetrated by a former Zero unit member who had become isolated and erratic. Outsourcing a war to proxy fighters does not eliminate geopolitical threats, it simply displaces it. The violence is delayed, relocated, and very often brought directly back to the homeland. Sometimes blowback takes the shape of institutional failure. In November 1979, armed Iranians stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, taking 53 Americans hostage. To get them out, President Jimmy Carter authorized Operation Eagle Claw, an incredibly complex rescue mission requiring perfect synchronization between multiple branches of the military. This map shows the sheer logistical weight of the plan. Transport planes carrying troops and fuel were supposed to take off from Oman, fly hundreds of miles, and rendezvous with 8 Navy helicopters launching from an aircraft carrier in the Arabian Sea. They had to meet in the dead of night at a remote salt flat in Iran called Desert One. But the friction of reality destroyed the plan. Helicopters suffered sudden hydraulic failures. A severe dust storm blinded the pilots. By the time they reached Desert One, they didn't have enough functional aircraft to proceed, and a miscommunication in the dust caused a helicopter rotor to slice into a fuel-loaded transport plane. 8 U.S. service members died in the resulting explosion. The mission was aborted. The hostages were scattered across Iran to prevent a second attempt, and the charred wreckage of American aircraft was broadcast on global television. The disaster forced the Pentagon to take a hard look at its deep structural flaws. The resulting investigation, known as the Holloway Report, highlighted a complete lack of joint training and unified command between the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines. Out of that cataclysmic night in the desert, the military was forced to restructure. It led directly to the creation of the United States Special Operations Command, or SOCOM, building the highly integrated special forces framework the military relies on today. The ripples of a single policy choice can extend for centuries. Hundreds of years ago, Tibet reorganized its entire civil and political structure around the teachings of Buddhism. Following the Buddhist tenets of peace and compassion meant Tibet gradually abandoned its military traditions. The state became highly pacifist, isolated, and entirely vulnerable to the expanding empire surrounding it. This flowchart illustrates how they solved that security crisis. Tibet struck a unique arrangement with the Mongol and later Manchu empires called Choyan, or the patron-priest relationship.
The Tibetan lamas provided spiritual legitimacy and religious instruction to the emperors, and in return, the empires provided military protection. For a long time, this was a highly effective geopolitical loophole. Tibet remained secure from outside invasion without having to maintain a standing army or violate its religious principles.
But centuries later, the Chinese government weaponized that exact history. They used the old patron arrangement as legal and historical proof that Tibet had always been a subservient vassal state to China, rather than an independent nation. In 1950, communist Chinese forces invaded. Because Tibet had outsourced its defense for centuries, it lacked the military infrastructure to resist. A subsequent CIA-backed Tibetan insurgency fought for decades, but ultimately collapsed. By outsourcing their national security to secure a temporary peace, Tibetan leaders unknowingly laid the historical groundwork for their own conquest. They lost their sovereignty to the very mechanism designed to protect it. We see this pattern across time and scale. Arming proxy rebels in the mountains of Afghanistan, trying to micromanage a complex rescue operation in the Iranian desert, outsourcing military protection to a neighboring empire. In every case, leaders believed they could tightly control the outcome. But whenever a nation acts outside its own borders, it immediately surrenders control to the unknown. The consequences of these decisions are rarely felt on the day an operation is launched or a treaty is signed. The bill comes due years, decades, or even centuries later. The unpredictable unknowns of foreign policy are the exact forces that shape the future. They determine the safety of citizens at home, the evolution of the military, and ultimately whether a nation survives at all.